Okay, good afternoon. I am Dr. Matthew Smith, a lecturer in the History Department, the Department of History and Archaeology here on campus. And this afternoon we'll be speaking with Professor Patrick Bryan, one of the editors of this book that we'll be talking about, Slavery, Freedom and Gender, the Dynamics of Caribbean Society. Professor Bryan is a long-standing member of the History Department, retired a few years ago, and I think for many people who know Jamaican history, he will be no stranger at all, having written and published several important works on Jamaican history, especially aspects of Jamaican social history. A work that I know a lot of people would know about is his famous study, The Jamaican People, which was published back in the late 80s, I believe. 2000, right. And he is one of the editors of this book, along with Professor Bryan Moore, Barry Higman, and Carl Campbell. And so we're going to speak with Professor Bryan about this book, Slavery, Freedom and Gender, the Dynamics of Caribbean Society. Thank you, Professor Bryan.
Nice to be here. Let's hope I can answer your questions.
I'm sure you more than can answer them. Let's start out by talking about this book. The book is a really interesting book because it collects a lot of the lectures of the delivered for the ELSA lecture. Perhaps start out for us by telling us who ELSA was and what's her importance to Caribbean history.
ELSA was born in Guyana in 1925, performed brilliantly at school and studied in London, University of London, did her first-class honors in her history and proceeded to her PhD in London. And then she came back to the Caribbean, but to UWI, and very quickly became professor of history and the first woman to be professor at the UWI, and certainly the first in the Department of History. By the time she came here, she was fairly well known for her study on the historiography of the Caribbean and her study on the slavery in the Leeward Islands. And her works were among the first in the Caribbean to look at Caribbean history from the inside, rather than as an adjunct of imperial history. So that is where her significance actually lies. To read her stuff, to read her material, in fact, is to indicate to you how the breadth of her reading and of her competence. She had, in my view, because as one of her students, sort of a philosophical approach to history, which reveals a deep reading of various philosophies. And her approach was that even a book which you might not like might have important material to reveal something about your situation and so on. So she had a very pragmatic view of that. Now, her lectures, which took place in what's known the Neville Hall Lecture Theatre, were always jam-packed. She came in at exactly 11 o'clock and proceeded to, she read her lectures. But people were just glued to what she was saying, because it was like a completely new experience.
Right.
Very articulate, very organized lectures, and so on. So she has influenced a whole generation or two.
Very true.
Of students.
Yeah.
And her involvement extended as well to the secondary schools, because here she worked in partnership with people like Roy Auger and Shirley Gordon. Her name does not appear as an author of The Making of the West Indies, but no doubt she had been part of the consultative process. So between the Making of the West Indies and all the material going out to the schools, and her association with Roy and Miss Gordon, Shirley Gordon, she was making a tremendous impact on people at all levels. She When I joined the staff I joined staff in 1970. She was very much there, but tragically died in 1980,
right.
I think, which was extremely upsetting. As I remember I did lectures for her, like on the Spanish Caribbean, because that is how she looked after young members of staff. You know, you have some expertise in the Dominican Republic or Hispaniola. Not that I don't know anything about it, but let students hear from this youngster.
Right.
Just
right.
coming.
Yeah.
And I remember giving a lecture on the Dominican Republic the very evening before she died. So the following day when I came to work and heard that she had died, I was just in a state of shock.
Yes, yes.
Personality-wise, an extremely unassuming, laid-back, and pleasant personality.
Yeah.
Very quick smile and so on. Always asking, how is the family?
Right.
Yeah.
The book actually has a photograph of Elsa Govayo in the front part of it, which captures that part of her personality. Also in the introduction, which is written by Bryan Moore, he speaks about being a student of Elsa Govayo's, as you were as well, and the impact that had on him.
The thing is that Bryan was her student as an undergraduate, but also
as a graduate student, right, as he mentions here.
He had far more exposure to
right. One of the things that he says really impacted him a lot as an undergraduate, very early on, was that she taught Caribbean history and emphasized that it was our history, that it was not a sort of colonial history or history tacked on to empire, but it was a history we should own. And that was clearly part of her inspiration. Which brings me to the book then, and the selection of pieces you have, which really, I think, reflect very well a sort of development of Caribbean history, which is part of the legacy of Elsa Govayo.
Yes. Now, in many ways, the debates initiated by Govayo continue in those selections. Now, those selections are entirely pragmatic. We didn't have a list of things that we wanted people to lecture on. We simply looked for people who we thought had achieved some distinction in Caribbean history, maybe had been doing original research in certain areas, and then we'd invite them to give these lectures. So how Moore has organized the book, Slavery and Freedom, and then Gender. That was not our organization. This is just an editorial convenience, as a matter of fact. But as he pointed out, the section on gender could just as easily, much of it, have fitted into the earlier section, because social, in fact, is about slavery. So we have had some really distinguished people, and what you'll find, though, is that the topics, because of the way speakers were chosen, are very, very varied. Even within that gender aspect, it's quite varied. And the variation continues after 1998, because I think the last lecture in that book is about 1998.
Correct, yeah.
But there are 14 other lectures that have come since.
Wow.
And it's even more varied.
Right, and I do want to talk about that. But let's look at some of the contributors to the actual volume we have here. And as you said, these are people who have really made their own breakthroughs in Caribbean history. B.W. Higman, Colin Palmer, Franklin Knight, Douglas Hall, Woodville Marshall, Monica Schuler, Bridget Brereton, Hilary Beckles, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, and Rex Nettleford are all among the essays here. Could you speak a little bit about some of the perspectives that have sort of been taken by these historians?
Okay. Now, if you say let's take the first one.
Right.
It's a bit unusual. Oh, I should point out that Moore did not present these in the order in which the lectures were given. So this one by Inukuri is certainly not the first one.
Right.
But it is Slavery and the Rise of Capitalism. And
Right.
what Inukuri, I think he's from Nigeria, did was to look at the impact of the slave trade on Africa itself. And he put it in the framework of the the capitalism thesis of Eric Williams and so forth. That was the initiatory position. Palmer's lecture, which comes much later, is actually looking at the continuation of African retentions culture in the Caribbean, and the formation of a creolized culture. I think he also touched upon the racial problems. Hickman's invention of slave society. This follows a period when people talk about the invention of tradition and
right.
all that.
And of nations too, and there are lots of books about that, right.
Did slavery really constitute a society? Was it a society? If you look at some works like Orlando Patterson,
right.
it's just a completely disjointed society held together by force. When we have the M.G. Smith
Plural Society,
which
right.
is a society held together by force. But there's another way to look at it, to see that there are the interactions between people. And if you look at, say, the Thistlewood work, there are some interactions which give the society some coherence. So I think that was it.
Right. And that is also something that ELSA Gavaya pioneered in her research,
exactly.
The focus on slave society.
Then Franklin Knight, who has also written extensively on the British Caribbean, the Caribbean as a whole, did a study on Cuba. It is the late 19th century Cuban equivalent of the sugar revolution of the 17th century in the British Caribbean. Though, of course, the difference in historical time made the Cuban experience a bit different. In the late 19th century, Santo Domingo also began its changes attributed to sugar.
Right.
But again, the experience becomes very different. In the case of Santo Domingo, it's sugar without slavery. In the case of Cuba, it is sugar and the end of slavery, closer to our experience. Now, chapter 5 of this book, which is done by Professor Douglas Hall.
Right.
Hall picked out just an aspect of the presence of Mr. Thistlewood in Jamaica. Thistlewood is a planter somewhere in Westmoreland. And Thistlewood has a very, very strong interest in horticulture. So whatever we might have to say about him and his sexual excesses and his links with fever and all that stuff and brutality without a doubt, there's this little spot in him, horticulture, and he really does discuss it. He becomes an expert in it. And it is one of the few glimpses we have of the history of horticulture.
In 18th century Jamaica, right.
The next one would be Marshall, and I must say that this particular pamphlet was always in tremendous demand.
That was a very famous piece for sure.
Yes.
Required reading for many years. Still is, I would say. Yeah.
Because what it does is to encapsulate all the debates about what happened in the post-emancipation period, and very subtly done and very, very convincing. So the post-labor labor problem revisited certainly is one of the major lectures. Now, Monica Schuler, who happens to be like Guyanese, and who had worked on the Taki Rebellion in Jamaica, I remember, and in fact also on anti-slave rebellions. She transferred her interest for the time being to St. Thomas, Jamaica. I mentioned that. Where she was looking at indentured Africans who had been brought into Jamaica after slavery.
Right, around the 1840s, yeah.
And she works with Maureen Warner Lewis on that aspect. But this now is what happens to the enslaved after they have been freed
in Guyana.
How do they adjust?
Right.
So it really follows up from the previous article done by Woodville.
Right. There's a clear thematic development in the arrangement of these chapters from slavery to freedom, and then the last section here, which is on gender, of which we have 5 essays, which is quite good.
The first one by Blanca Silvestrini. Blanca is Puerto Rican, and I think she's the only. Yes, she's the only Puerto Rican or Hispanic here.
Contributor, yeah. Yes, right.
Yeah.
And then Lucille Mathurin Mir, right.
In fact, hers might have been the very first lecture given.
Back in, I think, 1986 was when the series started, yeah.
But the Blanca Silvestrini thing is of particular interest because she had been working on Puerto Rican needle workers, interviewed dozens of women. And then with the new gender history, she went back to her notes and tapes and found using gender as this tool of analysis. It's like she came with a completely different story. So this is her story.
Right.
Yeah, so what Lucille Mayr's work did was to show the importance of female workers, because the assumption was that it was the men who were chopping the cane.
Right.
Far from the truth. Women were definitely involved there.
Right.
Beckles, I'm not too acquainted with this particular one, but if I know Beckles, he'll go and take a very critical position about the historiography. I think the last 2 chapters have one thing in common, that is the use of autobiographies and diaries.
Right.
And what they... I remember the thing about Beckles now. He's in fact suggesting that women have not been as invisible as people have been making out.
Okay.
And the point is really emphasized by the Bridget Brayton article.